Oh, this is good.
Okay, so today we are live here at Sheridan Park, and we have a guest today. So, Dylan, go ahead.
My name is Dylan. This is my friend and colleague, Jason.
Yes.
Jason, care to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Jason Ross. I'm a disability studies activist scholar, and I'm studying for my master's degree in disability studies. I'm graduating next June with 6 more credits left at CUNY, and I'm working on trying to establish people to recognize disability history, and understand that there's a correlation between disability history and LGBTQ history, LGBTQIA history, and non-conforming genders and stuff like that. That in the reality of people that were LGBTQ or IA, even with different genders, non-conforming genders, they had to deal with the same things that autistic people have to deal with even still today in terms of autistic conversion therapy and ABA, applied behavioral analysis. And this is a very important issue to allow people to be who they are and understand that just because someone is different or so-called neuroqueer, so to speak, or even or even a disabled person, doesn't mean that they have to be the likings to what a different condition of normal condition of what another person is, because everyone has some different normal conditions. Like I have my normal condition, Dylan has his normal condition, and everyone around us has different conditions that they like to live in. I don't like the word normal, but I just say it like this because that's the way people understand. But it's the way of the non-LGBTQ condition as I am, and the way Dylan is as a trans condition, or different as an autistic condition, or non-autistic condition, neurotypical condition, normal condition. Everyone has different ways of living in the community, and people have a right to understand the condition that they like to live with.
And so, Dylan, how does your wanting to be here at Stonewall sort of relate to Jason's comments?
Yeah, so I think definitely intersectionality is a big part. I remember when I was first starting out in high school, I started becoming very interested in the history of grassroots movements. One of the movements that struck me the most, that I admired the most,
they should have money lying around,
was actually the LGBTQ community. And the cultures and histories associated with that. And I think being here,
we need an inclusive community where people can understand that inclusion means that everyone has an ability to accept whoever you're with, to accept whoever you're in the community with, to accept who you see on strangers on the street, or if you go out anywhere, and just even in school, and understand that people need to understand that it's not really so much special needs that they say.
It's about human needs.
It's about human needs, that everyone has these needs that people need. And those needs are to build community in a community-based setting, not to be in some kind of congregative setting that's going to train the person to be something that or trying to be something that they're not. Because how can anyone, I don't know what's in Dylan's mind. Dylan doesn't know in my mind. People don't know what's in each other's minds, but in the reality, you can't change a person's thinking.
But B.F. Skinner would say there's nothing in your minds. It's just a conditioned social response.
Well,
Yeah.
and
And that's changeable. That can be that can be altered by stimulus response.
some of it can be, but for the most part, there's certain things inevitable that is in the brain structurally that you cannot change.
Yeah.
And that's in terms of being autistic, being if the person's being trans, gay, bisexual, intersex, non-conforming genders, or anything that's different from the so-called norm of the, I didn't say it this way, the heterosexual, non-disabled, Anglo-Saxon Christian male.
Yeah.
Even females were given the right that they were considered disabled at some point.
Yes.
And because of that, as being female, being disabled, a female could not be female. They had to be this weaker-minded person. But
Right.
what is weaker-minded? There's no such thing. They even call people with disabilities feeble-minded, and that was nothing.
Yeah. Well, you see, to add to that, and I think the standards applied to women are also applied to disabled people from the standpoint of purity and modesty. One of the unfortunate things is we don't talk about disability as it pertains to sexuality or gender identity. That's a systemic problem.
But at the same time, society doesn't understand that people with disabilities or the disability community in general, whether you define it as a disabled person or a person with disability, most people define it as a disabled person, will be the person that they need to be, because people just they don't want to accept people for who they are, and in the disability community especially, and even in the LGBTQ community, and even non-conforming genders, it's like, how can we understand who a person is unless we get to know the person? And the only way to get to know the person is by being in the community.
Yes.
And communicating, and even using communication that's not necessarily the spoken word either. If someone's using a communication device to speak, that's okay. And people need to just not look down, not try to get people to pass for a certain condition, not try to get people to speak with conviction, saying you can't speak with. I'm ignoring you because you're speaking with a computer, or I'm ignoring you because you're texting, or I'm ignoring you because you're not speaking with the spoken word. And
Well, the idea of unity, though, is an evolutionary concept, right? Because even within what is now known as the LGBTQ coalition, in the early days, transgender individuals were disenfranchised within that community.
yes, they were.
And you want to tell us a little bit, Dylan, about maybe some of the key historical figures that played a role in the Stonewall riots and transgender advocacy?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Sylvia and Martha?
Right. So, within the community, what people think of, people think first of all, in the same way that people think about disabled people, that we showed up out of thin air. The history, there's the history of gender identity, the trans community is much more vibrant and established than we give credit for.
Yes.
So when it comes to the two people you were just mentioning, Sylvia Rivera and Martha P. Johnson. All right, let's talk about them. So at the time, the LGBTQ community spent a lot of time at Stonewall. People normally associated with particularly gays and lesbians, but there was a trans following there as well.
Plus it's like every minority group wants some place to congregate for some kind of liberation.
Yes.
The LGBTQ community has Stonewall. The disability community has their places of liberation. The autistic community has their liberation. The women had their place for liberation. Blacks had their place for liberation. Everyone had, and so on and so on and so on. Because in order to be free, you have to and be liberated from a sector of condition that doesn't fit you. You need to be your own self and find the place to liberate yourself away from the sector that makes you feel not you, but at the same time, stand up to that community and say, listen, you're going to stand next to me in this inclusion no matter what, and we're going to be equals. We're going to be equals.
So, yes.
That's why me and Dylan stand here as equals.
Yes. So, it's interesting, I think. And I think unity is what both Sylvia Rivera and Martha P. Johnson were both asking for. So they were instrumental in starting the Stonewall riots, being instrumental in the LGBTQ rights movement. But I think in every movement, there's always the people who control it are still influenced by the world around them.
Yes.
And in the case of the LGBTQ community, the people who spoke the most, who got the most credit, were generally the cis gay men.
Yeah.
And
there's a lot of, like, even as a person, if a person is cis, there's privilege, right? And people ignore that privilege because they insist the privilege doesn't exist, that these other people are beneath them. But in reality, it has to do with the fact that they have privilege because they've always had rights. The white Anglo-Saxon Christian male non-disabled person has always had rights more than any other person.
Well, yeah. So here's in the I mean, there are different ways to think of the issue of privilege, but there is so this was true in the LGBTQ community at the time. In fact, there was a rally where Sylvia Rivera had enough.
Yeah.
She got up in front of the in front of the community during a rally, and she called out the gays who controlled the movement, suppressed the voices, and accused them of suppressing the voices of transgender people within the community. Now, I think that, the interesting thing, I think, is when we talk about the histories of social welfare and things like that. Sylvia Rivera also plays a role in that too. Her and Martha P. Johnson started this community house for trans youth, Star House, to help them dealing with being trans, to create a home for them. Now,
Because a lot of those folks were also low income.
low income, homeless, yes, that's an issue we see to this day in the LGBTQ community, that there's a lot of people who are low income, a lot of people who deal with homelessness within the LGBT community. So yeah, that's a factor as well. But I think that there are a lot of moments in history where we see the same themes.
Yes.
But you know what? We're getting
We're
getting a live question from one of our audience members right at this
Okay.
moment, who says that if the rule of the jungle, the Darwinian rule, right, is the survival of the fittest, right? Rigby Dreamer, our guest, questioner, wants to know what are the strong qualities within the autistic community and the LGBTQ community that can ensure its long-term survival.
I'd say dogmatic. The dogma of the autistic community and the LGBTQ community has driven us to be stronger, and from that, it's because of the way we've been treated in society, that society, the societal ableism that is associated with the disability community in general, and the way disability communities have been treated, that it has, that a lot of people have a lot of fight in them, and that fight creates dogma, and the dogma creates an upper battle between the two.
And that advocacy idea is what Sylvia and Marcia are known for, and what you're very involved in.
Right. So here's how I would define the issue.
Yeah.
I would say that, first of all, as far as the themes or qualities, togetherness, unity, shared struggle,
Opportunity.
also is, and I think,
to be in a community.
and I think that there's also the saying that people have, which is that ally is the gateway to being out yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a lot of things we could do, but I think unity is the answer here. And I think as we stand together as one, and as we take pride in all of our identities, and really talking about intersectionality, that's when we can stand strong. And I think leadership is important. I think that the way forward also, with a lot of people.
Okay, go soon.
Okay.
Yeah. So I didn't.
So we're going to keep going with
Yeah.
Dylan, but we're going to say goodbye to our guest, Jason.
Bye.
Thank you for helping us today.
You're welcome.
And we'll look forward to seeing you again.
And we'll see you definitely again.
Fantastic. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
So,
Thank you. Thanks very much. That was awesome.
yeah. So
He's
I
great.
think that's a factor.
And that idea, though, is also, like I said, intrinsic to what a lot of these early trans advocacy experts were sort of doing, not formulaically, right? Not they didn't get master's degrees or in sociology or whatever. They were just doing what they perceived need to be done to the most forgotten about individuals that they were in contact with all the time.
Yes, and I think that also the way forward is we also need to recognize leadership of people that fall into many different categories and who simultaneously identify as many things. I am a transgender woman, but I'm also diagnosed Asperger's. And so I think that it takes leaders from both communities to really shed light on what could be possible going forward.
And what do you see as the connection between issues of autism and gender nonconformity and even asexuality?
Yeah, I think that the at the core, it's the fact that all these different groups know what it means to be othered, and I think that it's within our differences which comes the basis of our unity, in the sense that those who have been othered can support one another to advance the goals and aspirations of the group as a whole.
And that relates a lot to what you're doing, right? Tell us about your current advocacy group, your current advocacy work.
I'm doing a lot of work now on the intersection of autism and gender dysphoria. I'm doing a lot of work on the advocacy of LGBTQ individuals within the disabled community. I'm also doing a lot of work on the issue of generally autism and sexuality, particularly asexuality, though, is turning into a big advocacy area for me. Because like the autistic community, which assumes that one of the many stereotypes is that we as autistic people are disinterested and supposedly lack empathy. Well, that's actually a similar stereotype of asexuality. Just because someone's asexual doesn't mean they're necessarily 100% anti-sex. There's a lot of different ways to interact with sexuality. Human sexuality is quite diverse. There are asexuals who are assumed to be disinterested in sex, but may interact with sex in a different way. There are asexuals who can identify with sex in one way or another, but just not the idea of having sex. And in my case, that's certainly true. I find human sexuality to be fascinating. And I find human sexuality to be quite comedic as well. So yes, I think that's a factor.
So our guest, remote guest, Rigby Dreamar, has another question for you, which is kind of interesting because as we've been talking about, the issues of autism and transgender communities, marginalized communities in general, low-income people, racially disenfranchised individuals and groups, all these micro communities are ultimately politicized, right?
Yes.
Are there any politicians? I know you're very interested in politics. Any politicians that you think are addressing this issue of intersectionality in a way that could build, at the, state, local, state, or even national level?
So at this point, I don't. Okay.
You mentioned, did you like Bernie Sanders in the last election?
Yes, I did.
And
Very much so.
Do you think he goes far enough, though?
Yes. I think one of the greatest lessons is, I think the future for all these issues lies within the support of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. I think that to advance any of these issues, disability rights, workers' rights, LGBT rights, issues of the social safety net, poverty, what it comes down to is whatever issue. In the current political climate we have today, it is not going to be addressed. The Republican Party has clearly left these marginalized groups behind.
Well, they want to eliminate them. Let's be frank.
That's true. Yes. Yes, you're right about that.
I mean, especially through elimination of voting rights, right?
Yes.
Limitations on voting rights.
Yeah.
Lack of education.
Yes.
Lack of safety net support structures. They want to leave it in the hands of private individuals, private corporations.
Right. And I think taking on the first step in advancing equality for all these groups has to be, unfortunately, taking on the corruption in government. There are many different groups out there who have a lot of interesting ideas to advance that agenda forward. I also think we should pay. There's this saying in politics that all politics is local. So the more we can do on a local level and on a state level, the better to advance these issues forward. For instance, on gender, New York City is in the process of recognizing non-binary to be a legal gender. On the issues of autism and the issues of disability, on the issues of disability, New York State is one of the few states that have self-directed services for developmentally disabled individuals.
But then again, right? So the states have these rights,
yes,
like New York State in particular. But then those oftentimes get into conflict with private insurance company regulations, right?
Yes.
You're dealing with that right now too.
Yes.
Things that you have a right to for on the state level, the insurance companies are saying, yeah, sure, you have the right to it, but as long as you pay for it.
Right. Yes. This is an issue. It's an issue that we find in the trans community with access to hormones, access for people who want it, access to surgery, access to laser hair removal, all these issues of access needs. Healthcare is a huge issue. And I think one of the major issues, is the system that's designed to support disabled individuals doesn't recognize that they're human beings and that their genders and sexualities matter. in turn, they don't know necessarily how to deal with LGBTQ individuals.
Well, because like gender dysphoria is not like a headache,
No,
right?
no. I would not recommend it on anyone. It's a very difficult thing to live with. Yeah.
And altogether, I mean, I think the point should be made that you've mentioned to me before, right? That when you take all these micro communities together, and the totality of people that are involved in either, gender nonconformity or mental illness or the disabled, low income, represent quite a huge voting bloc.
Yes. Yes. In fact, the disabled community is the largest constituency and the largest minority, because anyone can be born disabled and anyone could acquire disability at any point in their lives.
Now, are there voting restrictions on the disabled?
So disabled people do have the right to vote, and I should mention that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can receive reasonable accommodations at the polls. Now, which is honored in New York State. However, in places that have systemic voter suppression, I would imagine that there would be issues there. There are access issues to disabled people at the voting block, at the voting booth. There are a lot of access issues. But they do have the right, but there's a lot of logistical things that have to be taken into consideration.
So anything else you want to say here at Sheridan Park?
Is there anything else you think I should say?
I think we're pretty good. Let's just take a brief walk over to the inn then and look at, because you said you've never been inside.
No.
So let's take a look inside.
Okay.
It was pretty amazing to think that this park here that we're walking through is the site of 1969 confrontation that really led to majority of the advocacy that we are familiar with today. So apparently right inside the door here, there should be a plaque indicating...
Here.
Oh, other side.
There is a plaque.
Sorry. Plaque indicating... Well, not this plaque, another plaque. Indicating that the place had been raided. Oh yeah, look, there it is on the right. Right here. This one right here. This is very famous.
Yeah.
Because this was supposed to be kind of a branding, right, to anybody else. Beware all who enter here, right? Let's see what's inside. Kind of a dark. It's probably in much better shape than it was back in the 1950s. So one final question from our audience member here. Rigby Dreamer is very interested in our broadcast here today. Says, so how do you put this all in the context then of our constitutional commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
That's a very interesting question. I think the essence of the Constitution and the essence of what it of civic engagement is to ask yourself this fundamental question. Which is, who are we but the essence of yesterday? And how could tomorrow be better than today? And I think that the essence of that question is, while it's important to, because I think every generation has their opportunity to put their mark on the Constitution and what it means to be a citizen. And I think that in the case of marginalized communities today, I think that's important to advance the causes and ideas that made the community what it is. But I think in order to understand the essence and the importance of the Constitution and its inclusion of marginalized groups, we have to go back and analyze the events of yesterday. And I think that's the real reason why I decided to do a broadcast here today. And I think that there's that aspect of it. But I also think that as the liberal, as the progressive movement has taught over history, which is that the essence is how many more groups, with every group that we include and empower within our society, makes us stronger. So how can we be the best that we can be? While it is true, there's no such thing as a perfect human being. Every day, we have the opportunity to share, to grow, to learn, which I believe is the essence and power of the Constitution. Because no matter what our disagreements are, we can at least agree that the Constitution has a special place in history to advance the causes of the marginalized and the voiceless, which is the basis of our democracy. Because at the end of the day, it's not about whether we agree, whether we disagree. It's about our shared commitment of democratic values. And I think the power of the Constitution will be up there with the great documents of history. From the Magna Carta to the histories of democracy and direct democracy, particularly of ancient Greece, to all these, to the struggles of the French Revolution, to now. I think that these are lessons about what we could be, but what we become is really up to us.